At 6 a.m., the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, were shrouded in a thick fog. The sun had yet to rise, but the sound of roaring engines breaking through the early morning silence was the signal that something historic was about to unfold. In that exact moment, 7 of the most powerful men on the planet, the CEOs of foreign mining giants who had been looting Burkina Faso's gold for decades, were simultaneously taken into custody by special forces. These men, accustomed to private jets, palatial estates, and laughing at local governments, were now handcuffed, terrified, and unsure of what to do next. Among them, one name stood out: Victor Pro, the CEO of Goldmax Corporation, the world's largest gold company; Jean-Claude Dubois, the head of Western Gold Mining; and Michael Thompson, a top executive at Pacific Resources, just to name a few. But how could one man, an African leader, accomplish what many thought impossible? How could someone so small in terms of power bring down giants that had crushed his people for over 50 years? The answer lies in Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, who, with cunning and patience, devised a plan to end an era of exploitation that had lasted too long. It wasn't a fluke. Ibrahim Traoré had been meticulously preparing for this moment for months. He knew that his people were being devoured by the very companies that, through fraudulent contracts and bribes, were draining the country's wealth while the people starved. And one day, in the darkest hour, he decided enough was enough. No one knew what Traoré was planning, but when the mining bosses fell, the whole world realized something had changed forever. For over 5 decades, the gold mines of Burkina Faso had been the playground of foreign mining companies. These corporations had quietly siphoned off vast amounts of the country's precious resources, leaving the local population to struggle in poverty. They extracted gold at an astonishing rate, yet the taxes and benefits that flowed back to the state were minimal, a scandal that had been hidden for years under layers of corruption. But Ibrahim Traoré was determined to expose the truth. With a strategy built on months of careful planning, Traoré gathered a team of international law experts, forensic accountants, and satellite imaging specialists. They began to dig into the financial records of every foreign mining company operating in Burkina Faso. The results were horrifying. For every dollar of gold extracted, the people of Burkina Faso received mere pennies in return. Traoré's team uncovered evidence that over $500 billion worth of gold had been taken from the country over the past 50 years, yet only a fraction, less than $10 billion, had ever reached the state's coffers. But that wasn't all. As they dug deeper, Traoré and his team uncovered a vast network of tax evasion, environmental destruction, and human rights violations. Some mining companies had resorted to using child labor, while others systematically destroyed the environment, poisoning rivers and causing long-term health issues for local communities. The situation was grim, and Traoré knew that drastic action was necessary. One of the most shocking discoveries was the level of corruption at the highest levels of government. Traoré's team found evidence that in 2015, Marc Carbour, the country's former energy minister, had accepted a $50 million bribe from Goldmax Corporation in exchange for a drastic reduction in the company's tax rate. In fact, the company had paid just 3% of the taxes they owed, despite making billions in profits from Burkina Faso's natural resources. It was a deal that cost the country $2 billion every year. And that was just the beginning. Western Gold Mining had employed a variety of tricks to evade taxes, including producing fake invoices that undervalued the price of gold sold on the market. Pacific Resources had its own twisted tactics. They inflated workers' wages on paper, claiming false tax deductions and pocketing the difference. For months, Traoré's team sifted through thousands of financial documents, carefully piecing together the true scale of the theft. But the real bombshell came when they examined the private deals made between these mining companies and corrupt government officials. These secret agreements had allowed the companies to expand their operations into new territories, displacing entire villages in the process. In one particularly shocking case, Western Gold Mining had bribed François Cabaret, the brother of the then president, to secure 3 new mining licenses on land that belonged to local villagers. The result? Over 50,000 people were forcibly displaced from their homes and farms. an atrocity that would have gone unnoticed if Traoré hadn't uncovered the details. Ibrahim Traoré had seen enough. He gathered all the evidence and filed a case at the International Criminal Court, charging these companies with crimes against humanity, forced displacement, child labor, and environmental destruction. The court accepted the charges, and Traoré took the next bold step. He froze the bank accounts of all the mining companies, seized their local assets, and placed all the gold reserves under state control. These reserves, worth over $100 billion, now officially belong to the people of Burkina Faso. The world reacted instantly. Global media outlets exploded with coverage, but the reactions weren't as favorable as many might have hoped. Western media labeled Traoré a dictator, while the European Union and the United States scrambled to organize emergency meetings and issue threats. They demanded the release of the CEOs, warning that their arrests would cause irreparable harm to the country's economy. But Traoré was unfazed. "We are applying the law," he said firmly. "For 50 years, these companies broke every rule, evaded taxes, and exploited our land and our people. Now, finally, justice is being served." As the international community trembled, the people of Burkina Faso stood strong behind their president. Hundreds of thousands filled the streets of Ouagadougou, waving banners that read, "Our gold is ours." The once silent majority now had a voice, and that voice was louder than any threat from the West. Traoré's operation had been flawless, a masterstroke of meticulous planning that left no room for error. He had known that in order to truly strike at the heart of the multinational mining giants, he would have to catch them off guard, and that's exactly what he did. For months, he had quietly built his case, placing informants at mining sites, using drones to monitor activity, and employing satellite imaging to track the flow of gold. The information he gathered was chilling, yet it was only the tip of the iceberg. In the early hours of the morning, as the CEOs were waking up in their lavish hotels, Ibrahim Traoré's forces were already in position. Each hotel where the foreign mining executives were staying had been surrounded by Burkinabe special forces, who had orders to detain their targets simultaneously. The element of surprise was Traoré's greatest weapon, and as the hotel doors were violently kicked down, the CEOs had no chance to escape. Their world, built on decades of corruption and greed, had come crashing down in an instant. Victor Pro, the CEO of Goldmax, was sleeping in his penthouse suite, unaware that his reign had come to an end. He was arrested in his pajamas, his private security team completely powerless against the sudden onslaught of Traoré's elite forces. Before he could even comprehend what was happening, he was taken to one of Burkina Faso's most secure prisons. Jean-Claude Dubois, head of Western Gold Mining, was no better off. He had prepared an escape plan. His private jet was already fueled and waiting at the airport. But in a move that left him breathless with shock, Traoré had already taken control of the airspace, sealing all borders and locking down the country. Dubois' jet never left the ground. As he tried to flee, he was intercepted on the runway and detained by special forces. He never had a chance to board the plane, his escape dreams dashed by the sheer precision of the operation. Michael Thompson of Pacific Resources, known for his cunning and ruthless business practices, thought he could outsmart the authorities by hiding in plain sight. He was found in a meeting room at his hotel, frantically trying to transfer company assets out of the country. His laptop, still open when he was apprehended, became damning evidence of his criminal activities. Traoré had orchestrated every detail with chilling accuracy. The CEOs thought they were untouchable, but they had underestimated the man who had spent months carefully scrutinizing their every move. This wasn't just a raid, it was a statement. Ibrahim Traoré had declared war on the corporations that had been looting Africa for generations, and he wasn't backing down. The power dynamic had shifted in a matter of hours. The men who once believed they could operate with impunity were now at the mercy of the very people they had exploited. The prisoners were transported to maximum security prisons, where they would face charges that would shake the very foundations of their operations. Their arrogance, their greed, and their sense of invincibility were all exposed as lies. But Traoré's plans didn't end with the arrest of these high-profile criminals. He had carefully crafted a strategy to ensure that their downfall was complete. He knew that these companies would not go down without a fight, and he had prepared for that too. Months before the operation, Traoré's legal team had begun compiling evidence, piecing together a network of fraud, tax evasion, human rights violations, and environmental destruction. As he pored over the financial documents, it became clear that these companies had engaged in the most systematic exploitation imaginable. They had falsified their reports, reported far less gold than they had actually extracted, and paid taxes so low that it was a joke. One of the most shocking revelations came from Goldmax Corporation. In 2019, they had extracted $500 million worth of gold from the Topco mine, but only $5 million of that had made its way into Burkina Faso's treasury. The rest had been smuggled out of the country, hidden in shell companies and offshore accounts. It was a staggering example of the greed and corruption that had fueled the country's economic woes. Western Gold Mining had perfected a different scheme. They created fake invoices, selling gold at below-market prices to themselves, inflating the value of the transactions to claim tax deductions. This allowed them to dodge millions in taxes each year, while lining their pockets with the proceeds from the stolen resources. Meanwhile, Pacific Resources had an even more insidious tactic. They used the salaries of their workers to falsify financial records. By reporting inflated wages, the company claimed excessive tax deductions and kept the difference for themselves. These revelations were enough to send shockwaves through the international business community. But the real bombshell came when Traoré's team uncovered the bribes that had been paid to government officials in exchange for preferential treatment. These payments weren't just small-time kickbacks. They were multi-million-dollar deals that allowed the mining companies to operate without fear of oversight or accountability. In 2015, Mark Carbour, the energy minister at the time, had accepted $50 million in bribes from Goldmax in exchange for reducing the company's tax rate from 30% to just 3%. This shady deal alone had cost the country $2 billion in lost revenue every year, while the people of Burkina Faso continued to live in poverty. The depth of the corruption was so vast that it seemed impossible to grasp, but Traoré had it all documented. He had everything he needed to make his case, and the world was about to see just how deep the rot ran. The scale of the exploitation didn't stop there. Western Gold Mining had bribed François Caboret, the brother of the sitting president, to secure 3 new mining licenses in 2017. These licenses granted the company access to land that belonged to local villages, and in the process, over 50,000 people were forcibly displaced from their homes. The companies made millions, while entire communities were uprooted and left to fend for themselves. Traoré wasn't content with simply arresting the executives. He wanted justice, and he wanted it to be swift and uncompromising. He filed criminal charges against the mining companies at the International Criminal Court, charging them with crimes against humanity, forced displacement, child labor, and environmental destruction. His legal team worked around the clock, ensuring that every document, every transaction, and every piece of evidence was accounted for. The charges were so severe that the international community couldn't ignore them. The ICC accepted the case, and the eyes of the world turned to Burkina Faso. But the backlash from the West was immediate. France, the United States, and the European Union issued public threats, warning Traoré that his actions would have serious consequences. They called him a dictator, a populist, and a threat to global business. But Ibrahim Traoré was unmoved. "We are applying the law," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "For 50 years, these companies have broken every rule. They have exploited our land and our people, and now finally, justice is being served." As the international community scrambled to contain the fallout, the people of Burkina Faso rallied behind their leader. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets, holding banners that read, "Our gold is ours," and chanting Traoré's name. The message was clear. The era of exploitation was over, and Africa was no longer willing to be a silent victim. The moment the world's most powerful mining executives were arrested, the shockwaves reverberated across the globe. The headlines exploded. The Western media couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré has just executed a direct assault on the global mining industry, they said. A dictator has seized power. But in Burkina Faso, The people were celebrating. For the first time in decades, they felt like they were in control of their own destiny. And it was all thanks to one man. Inside the maximum security prisons of Burkina Faso, the arrested CEOs were beginning to realize the full weight of their situation. Victor Pro, the CEO of Goldmax, had been arrested in his pajamas, his private security force completely powerless to stop the Burkinabe special forces. The moment he stepped into that prison cell, the reality hit him. The golden days were over. He tried to resist, even attempting a hunger strike, but Ibrahim Traoré wasn't moved by his theatrics. "Our mine workers go hungry every day," Traoré calmly remarked in a press conference. "Maybe it's time you learned what that feels like." Jean-Claude Dubois, the head of Western Gold Mining, had been preparing for his escape, but his private jet had never even left the runway. With the borders closed, he had nowhere to run. Dubois, once untouchable, was now stuck in a country where the law no longer played in his favor. Traoré had already taken control of the country's airspace and locked down the borders. When Dubois attempted to leave by car, he was intercepted by armed forces and detained with the rest of his criminal colleagues. Then there was Michael Thompson from Pacific Resources, who had thought his connections would protect him. He had been in a hotel meeting room, trying to secretly transfer assets and hide money, but his open laptop had become his undoing. The evidence was right in front of him, and when the special forces raided his room, it was all over. All of their wealth, all their power, and all their arrogant superiority had been rendered meaningless in a matter of hours. For Traoré, the arrests were only the beginning. He had planned this moment for months, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The mining corporations would do whatever it took to protect their interests. They were already scheming, preparing legal teams, and plotting their next moves. But Traoré wasn't going to let them wiggle their way out. He knew the full extent of their crimes, and he wasn't going to allow them to slip through the cracks like so many corrupt leaders had done before. Traoré's team had done more than gather financial documents. They had uncovered a well-oiled machine of fraud, corruption, and exploitation. Goldmax Corporation, for example, had reported extracting 10 tons of gold per day from the Topco mine, but the official figures showed just 1 ton. Where did the other 9 tons go? Simple. Straight into the pockets of the company and its network of corrupt officials. And what did Burkina Faso get in return? A mere fraction of the true value of the gold. Dubois Western Gold Mining used even more insidious tactics. The company created fake invoices for the sale of gold, underreporting the actual value. The difference? It vanished into offshore accounts, hidden from the eyes of the government. This wasn't just a few bad actors. It was a global scheme designed to rob an entire nation. And then there was Pacific Resources, whose crimes went even further. They had been dumping cyanide into the country's rivers, poisoning entire ecosystems, and causing cancer rates to skyrocket. The company had been mining without any regard for the environment or the health of the people living nearby. Children had been working in the mines, their lungs filled with dust, their futures shattered before they even had a chance to dream. All this while the company had been reporting fake worker wages to evade taxes. As Traoré's legal team sifted through the mountains of evidence, the depth of the corporation's criminality became more clear. In 2015, Goldmax Corporation had paid $50 million in bribes to Mark Carbour, the energy minister, to ensure the company's tax rate was slashed from 30% to just 3%. This deal alone cost the people of Burkina Faso billions of dollars every year. It wasn't just corruption, it was a systematic, ongoing theft of the country's resources. But the situation was even more horrifying when Traoré discovered how these companies had treated the local population. Entire villages had been displaced without so much as a second thought. And for what? So that foreign companies could extract precious metals and leave behind nothing but devastation. In 2017, Western Gold Mining had bribed the president's brother, François Caboret, to secure new gold mining licenses. These licenses granted them access to land that belonged to local villagers. Over 50,000 people were forcibly displaced from their homes and farms, their livelihoods destroyed. For the first time, the people of Burkina Faso began to see the full extent of the betrayal. It wasn't just the CEOs in their luxury hotels or the government officials pocketing bribes. It was the entire system that had allowed this exploitation to continue for decades. The world had turned a blind eye to the suffering of millions, while these companies grew richer and more powerful. And now, the people of Burkina Faso were no longer willing to stand by. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just fighting for Burkina Faso. He was fighting for Africa. The case against these mining giants was a case against a system that had held the continent in chains for far too long. If he could win here, if he could show the world that Africa had the power to stand up for itself, then other nations would follow. And that's exactly what began to happen. As the CEOs sat in their cells, awaiting their trials, Traoré continued to move forward with his plan. He took control of the gold reserves that had been stolen for decades. He froze the bank accounts of the mining companies and placed all of their assets under the control of the state. For the first time, the wealth of Burkina Faso was no longer in the hands of foreign corporations. It was in the hands of the people. Traoré made sure that the revenue from the gold would go directly to the people who had suffered the most. 70% of the income from the nationalized mines would be used for public services, such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure. It was a direct challenge to the system that had allowed these mining giants to thrive. No longer would the people of Burkina Faso be left to starve while foreign companies enriched themselves. But even as the trial progressed, the Western powers pushed back. The European Union convened an emergency meeting, and the United States issued a statement condemning the actions of the Burkinabe government. The French government, particularly, could not hide their outrage. "This is an assault on our companies, and we will make sure there are consequences," they declared. But Ibrahim Traoré was unmoved. As the trial of the foreign mining executives began, the whole world was watching. The attention of international media was fixated on Burkina Faso, and the reactions from Western nations were swift and furious. The European Union immediately called for an emergency meeting, and the United States condemned the actions of the Burkinabe government. The French government was particularly vocal, claiming that the arrest of the mining CEOs was an attack on their national interests and demanding their immediate release. For Ibrahim Traoré, these threats were nothing more than the desperate cries of a dying system. He remained calm, unshaken by the pressure, and made it clear that Burkina Faso would not back down. "We are applying the law," he stated firmly in a press conference. "These companies have stolen from us for decades, exploiting our resources and destroying our environment. Now, finally, justice is being served." But the world wasn't just watching from the sidelines. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this was more than just a legal battle. It was a battle of ideologies. For the first time, an African nation was standing up to the global powers that had long been allowed to exploit the continent's resources with impunity. This was not just about Burkina Faso. It was about the future of Africa as a whole. Ibrahim Traoré was leading a revolution, one that had the potential to change the entire global economic order. Despite the threats from Western governments, the people of Burkina Faso were unwavering in their support for Traoré. In fact, the arrest of the CEOs had sparked a nationwide movement. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Ouagadougou and other cities, waving banners that read, "Our gold is ours," and chanting Traoré's name. For the first time in decades, the people felt empowered. They had been the victims of exploitation for so long, but now they were standing tall, demanding justice. The protesters were not just celebrating Traoré's victory. They were demanding the return of what was rightfully theirs, the wealth that had been stolen from their land, their people, and their future. In the villages where the gold was mined, people who had once lived in squalor were now filled with hope. The forced displacements, the environmental destruction, the health crises, these were all the result of the mining companies' greed. And now, with Traoré's leadership, there was finally a chance for redemption. Victor Pro, Jean-Claude Dubois, and the rest of the CEOs sat in their cells, awaiting trial, but they were beginning to realize the magnitude of the situation. What they had once taken for granted, control, power, wealth, was slipping away. They had underestimated the resolve of Ibrahim Traoré, a man who had fought for years to protect his people. Now, in a final attempt to save themselves, the mining executives began reaching out to their lawyers, offering bribes and deals in exchange for their freedom. Victor Pro, desperate to escape the inevitable, offered an enormous sum of money, $1 billion, to secure his release. The offer was rejected outright by Traoré, who laughed at the audacity of it. "What is $1 billion to us?" Traoré said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Compared to the $500 billion you have already stolen from us, your offer is laughable. This is our money, and it will be used to rebuild our nation." Jean-Claude Dubois, on the other hand, attempted a different approach. He sent his lawyers to negotiate a deal for his release. But Traoré wasn't interested in talking terms. He had already made it clear. There would be no deals, no compromises. The CEOs would face justice for their crimes, no matter how much money they offered or how many threats they made. Meanwhile, the trial continued, and the evidence against the mining companies was overwhelming. Each CEO faced a staggering number of charges. Victor Pro, the head of Goldmax, was charged with 234 crimes, including tax evasion, bribery, environmental destruction, and forced displacement of civilians. Western Gold Mining's Jean-Claude Dubois faced 189 charges, the most disturbing of which was the use of child labor. It had been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that children as young as 12 had been working underground in the company's mines, breathing toxic fumes and enduring brutal conditions that resulted in untimely deaths. But perhaps the most horrifying charges were leveled against Michael Thompson, the CEO of Pacific Resources. Thompson's company had been dumping cyanide into Burkina Faso's rivers, poisoning entire communities and killing thousands. It was revealed that Thompson's actions had caused cancer rates to skyrocket in 17 villages, and more than 2,000 people had lost their lives as a direct result of the contamination. The testimonies from victims were heartbreaking, and the evidence was irrefutable. Musa Orihugo, a 23-year-old man who had started working in the mines when he was just 8, took the stand. He spoke of his debilitating chronic lung disease, a result of the years he had spent working in the toxic environment of the mines. "They stole my childhood," he said, his voice breaking. "They stole my health, my future. They took everything from me." Another witness, Miriam Cow, a 70-year-old woman whose village had been forcibly evicted to make way for the gold mines, spoke through tears. "Our ancestors' graves were on that land," she said softly, shaking with emotion. "We didn't just lose our homes. We lost everything. They took it all for gold, and in return, we received nothing, just $100. Traoré sat in the courtroom every day, his face resolute, listening to the testimony and absorbing the stories of the victims. He didn't sit behind a desk or hide in an office. He stood with his people, his gaze unwavering. He understood the weight of the moment. This was not just a trial for the executives. It was a trial for the future of Africa. The world was watching, and Ibrahim Traoré was determined to show them that Africa had the strength to rise up against centuries of exploitation. The courtroom fell silent as the final verdicts were read aloud. Ibrahim Traoré had just delivered the most significant blow to the global mining industry in history, and the world was watching. The CEOs of Goldmax, Western Gold Mining, and Pacific Resources had expected to escape justice with their wealth and influence intact. But the truth was undeniable, and justice had finally been served. Victor Pro, the head of Goldmax Corporation, was sentenced to 50 years in prison and slapped with a $10 billion fine. Jean-Claude Dubois of Western Gold Mining received 45 years behind bars, along with an $8 billion fine. Michael Thompson of Pacific Resources, responsible for the poisoning of entire villages, was sentenced to life in prison. The damage these men had caused was irreparable, and now they would face the consequences. The other executives weren't spared either. Robert McKenzie, James Harrison, Peter Williams, and David Anderson all received lengthy sentences, with convictions for crimes ranging from forced displacement of civilians to environmental destruction. They had been the architects of suffering on an unimaginable scale, and the court's decision was a moment of reckoning for their monstrous actions. But the most astonishing part of the trial came with the seizure of the CEO's personal assets. The luxury jets, yachts, villas, and rare art collections were confiscated by the Burkinabe state. These assets, worth billions, were liquidated, and the proceeds were allocated to compensate the victims of their exploitation. It was the ultimate humiliation for men who had once believed they were above the law. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was just the beginning. The nationalization of Burkina Faso's gold reserves was now a reality, and the country had full control of its mining operations. No longer would foreign corporations siphon off the wealth of the land. 70% of the profits from the gold mines would be invested in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. The people of Burkina Faso would finally reap the rewards of their country's natural resources. The transformation in the country was immediate. In the first year following the nationalization, Burkina Faso's income skyrocketed by 300%. New schools were built, healthcare systems expanded, and the poverty rate began to fall. For the first time, the people had hope. Children who had once been forced to work in the mines were now going to school. The streets of Ouagadougou were filled with songs of celebration, and the air was thick with a sense of possibility. And the revolution didn't stop at the borders of Burkina Faso. Other African nations began to take notice. In Mali, President Goïta launched an investigation into the mining industry. In Guinea, President Condé began nationalizing the bauxite industry. In Niger, the government took control of its uranium mines. The message was clear. Africa was done with exploitation. The old colonial system was crumbling, and a new era was beginning. Ibrahim Traoré had sparked a movement that could not be undone. He had shown the world that Africa was no longer a passive victim. It was a continent ready to fight for its resources and its future. The people of Burkina Faso had reclaimed what was theirs, and now the rest of Africa would follow suit.